So I'm JB. My full name is spelled out. You know why I kind of go by JB. And I'm a founding member of the Oak Table, which was, as I recall, as much as I can recall, a very fun event a number of years ago. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 2000 or 2001. I don't have a long bio page for myself because I'm not a consultant, but I'll just call myself an Oracle performance maven and an ASH expert and a bodyboarder, the latter of which I've spent the least amount of time among those things doing, but it's also the thing that I'm getting better at the most, so it's kind of pretty fun. So I recommend it. So the origin of this talk is an inquiry I got, a rather cryptic, typically cryptic inquiry I got over email, title of which, subject matter, AWR. I've anonymized the Oak Table member who sent me this email, but I'm not sure if he's in the audience or not, but I'm pretty sure he'd be the only person in the audience that wouldn't be insulted if I called him a slob. So, for purposes of identification, we'll refer to him as Mr. Slob from now on. Okay. So, picking your brain here, I'll just read it. I'm sure you've explained this to us before. Why is it that sometimes the top weights in AWR, top 10, some greater than 100, when weights for DB CPU is high? Okay, so there's a lot kind of implied behind that question, right? There's a lot of sort of unstated stuff, which is typical of Mr. Slob. But I didn't really understand the question. I was like, okay, it's kind of cryptic. So, can you send me the AWR? Yeah, sure. Okay, so look at the AWR. CPU plus weight, so CPU 40.4. There's only really 2 weight events going on. User I/O, not a big surprise if you know Mr. Slob. You add up the CPU time and the wait time, and you get 127.2% of DB time. He was basically asking me, WTF with that, right? And, okay, let's look into it. So, quick review. The model, the mental model. DB time is equal to DB CPU time plus wait time, right? It's pretty simple. And it's not new. So DB time is summed over all foreground sessions, so we isolate foregrounds when we speak about DB time, and wait time is considered only active wait time, so we're not talking about idle waits, of which there are some. And the model significantly presumes that CPU and wait are non-overlapping. These are sort of disjoint measures of time. Okay. And the method, DB time method, as Graham and I have sometimes called it, is really just account for the DB time accurately, account for time in the database accurately, reduce the database time spent doing the same amount of work, and you've improved performance, right? Same work, less time, better performance. Focusing on large chunks of similarly spent time, because if the time is similarly spent, maybe the same correction will reduce the time, and if it's a large chunk, you have a good chance of making a big improvement, right? But if the system is CPU bound, you have to reduce CPU time first, right? Why? Well, if the system is CPU bound, first of all, wait times are inaccurate, and so chasing wait events isn't very smart. But if the system is CPU bound, you're out of gas. Doesn't matter what you do on your wait events, you're not going to get any more work out of the system if you don't have any more CPU to use, right? So wait times are inaccurate, and wait tuning is irrelevant in the case of a CPU-bound system. Mr. Wood just entered the room, and that makes me much more nervous than I was before.
He's not Mr. Slob.
He is not Mr. Slob. I haven't been insulting you behind your back. But in this case, it looks like we kind of have a problem at step 1, right? Accounting for DB time accuracy. There's some question about the accuracy of what this AWR report is actually telling us. It's kind of saying that we can use more than 100% of DB time. Well, how is that possible, right? So let's do a little more review. DB time. So that's foreground session. We've mentioned this in database calls, spent in database calls. It's measured by the database code, and it's measured using very clear instrumentation points. When the call enters, start a timer. When the call exits, when the database is produced a response and sends it back. Stop a timer, right? So it's kind of like Costco. You know, you go into Costco and the people check your card. Imagine if they clicked a stopwatch and then when you check out, you know, they, right? If they clicked it again, right? That would be your Costco time, right? So DB time is similar. It's sort of at a gross level. It's a very gross time. And then system DB time is just the sum of all session DB time. So we kind of trust DB time accuracy pretty implicitly. It's simple instrumentation at sort of the two endpoints of the time you spend in the database. Now, it's not always entirely accurate, but it's usually pretty, it's a very trustable number. So we tend to sort of pin that one down as a starting point. So DB CPU is basically foreground CPU actually used. So this is actual CPU cycles used, which means in particular that it does not include time spent waiting for the CPU. It's measured by the OS, but collected by Oracle. So it's actually an independent instrumentation source from the actual Oracle code itself. I mean, the Oracle code fetches the instrumentation value. The Oracle code does not try to measure it directly. And then a final note, you know, AIX CPU reporting is highly suspect for under hyperthreading, and if you want to talk about that, I'm sure Mr. Wood would be glad to educate you on some of the subtle issues there. So we have high confidence in DB CPU accuracy, okay, except on AIX. Okay, ASH and DB time. Let's talk a little bit again about ASH. Again, reviewing things, hopefully people have seen this material before, so it's highly distilled. But in ASH, when we use ASH, we estimate DB time as basically we count the number of sessions sampled and then multiply by the ASH interval time. The ASH interval, by default, is 1 second for the in-memory ASH, and then the subsampling that takes place in AWR effectively produces 10-second interval ASH samples. So in particular, when an ASH sample is said it's on CPU, it basically means the session is in a call and it's not waiting, okay? So it's a derived value, it's not observed. The ASH sampler doesn't say, oh, session 23, it's on CPU, so I'll mark it as on CPU. No, it says session 23, is it in a call? Yes. Is it in a wait? No. Okay, it's on CPU. Right? So that's sort of the way to think about ASH. So, so it's kind of a less trustable number in that sense, right? It's not really observed to be on CPU, and it's dependent on accurate wait event instrumentation and things like that. But one nice thing about ASH is it always conforms to the model, okay? A session sampled into ASH is either recorded as being on CPU or recorded as being in a wait. In other words, the sum of all the sessions on CPU and the sum of all sessions in a wait will equal the sum of all sessions, right? You'll never get greater than 100%. The problem we're sort of looking at that introduced this talk. So, in particular, sessions that use CPU in a wait will never show up as on CPU because they'll be in a wait. And ASH will say, oh, you're in a wait, right? So, now, according to the model, we don't use CPU in a wait, right? So maybe that we don't think of that as a big problem. Maybe we think it shouldn't be a big problem. Anyway, just be mindful that the AWR report presumes accurate instrumentation. It's kind of based on a presumption of accuracy of instrumentation, right? And same with Adam, kind of unfortunately in that case, because he's supposed to be smart. Instrumentation is not always accurate. So ergo, you know, the AWR report and then Adam may actually be misleading, which is kind of maybe what happened here. And just as a sort of a personal opinion, wait a minute, let's go back another one here. AWR and Adam could and should do some sanity checks of this kind, but they don't. In other words, they could look for the potential of instrumentation issues and report that as a finding. Adam would report it as a finding. All right, back to the AWR. So first things to ask, right? What's the elapsed time of the report? What version of Oracle are we talking about? Why do we care about Oracle version? Well, you know, bug lookup, what's in the AWR report kind of depends on the version. What data is available can also depend on the version. And then, you know, is the system CPU bound? Again, if the system is CPU bound, that's your problem. And, you know, worrying about wait events not adding up is probably not so important. So you begin at the beginning, at the very beginning of the report. Conveniently, we can find the answers to the first few questions. So this is a 12102 report, which is nice because there's some extra information in the AWR report as of version 12. 36 core system. Elapsed time 2 minutes. Anybody used to running AWR reports over 2-minute intervals? Yeah, it's a little bit odd, right? Well, if you knew Mr. Slav, you'd kind of understand. He's not exactly testing production workload. He's probably doing something a little, you know, very specific, right? So just to answer our questions, right? DB version 12102. Okay, if we have to look up any bugs, we know where, you know, we know what version we're talking about. 2 minutes of elapsed time. Again, not your average AWR report, but Mr. Slav is not your average guy. And is the system CPU bound? Well, it's not CPU bound. That's pretty obvious, right? So it's obvious to me because 36 is much greater than 5, right? But what's 36 and what's 5, right? Well, 36 is the number of cores, and 5 is the average active sessions, right? How did we get that? Well, 10 minutes divided by 2 minutes equals 5. So average active sessions is elapsed time divided by, DB time divided by elapsed time, right? So we can just read right off of it, and you know, if your average active sessions is 5 and you got 36 cores, you're not CPU bound, okay? That much is clear. So that's good, that's good. Mr. Slav's not CPU bound. So next things to think about, you know, what is the DB time over the interval? We've already seen that. What is the DB CPU over the interval? We actually already saw that. So what's the expected wait time? It's just the difference, right? Total DB time minus DB CPU, that's your expected wait time. And then another thing that we'll want to ask, and that luckily we can answer in part because this is a version 12 AWR, is that it includes some ASH information. Now, it would have been much better to get a full ASH report, but we have some ASH information in AWR, and that actually is going to serve us in this investigation. So, looking at the load profile to try and answer some of these questions. DB time, again, 5, you know, DB time per second is 5, which is another name for that is, you know, DB, you know, seconds per second of DB time is what? Average active sessions, right? This thing comes up a lot. DB CPU is 2, so, you know, 5 per second times 120 seconds, so 600 seconds of DB time. Of course, we already saw that. It was 10 minutes. 10 minutes is 600 seconds. DB CPU, 2 times 120, 120 seconds in the interval, 2 per second, so we get 240 seconds. So the expected wait time, 360. So a little bit of data viz goes a long way. Let's just put the little chart up here, right? So we got DB time on the left, DB CPU on the right, our two sort of stake in the ground numbers, and then, you know, we sort of show the wait time as being the excess DB time above the DB CPU. So, all right, simple enough. So if we add the measured wait times from the top 10 list, again, there was only 2 wait events of any consequence in this report. They were both user I/O, right? So let's stack those on top of the CPU. And then now we see the problem, right? DB time only goes up to 100, and CPU plus all the recorded wait time, the CPU time, the measured CPU, well, the CPU time fetched from the OS, plus all of the supposedly measured wait times add up to more than the total DB time. So that's kind of in essence what the problem is. So let's just consult our friend Ash and see what he has to say. So this is actually where the 2-minute interval worked out in my favor, because the ASH information in the AWRs is actually sort of fine-grained. It's not summed up very well, right? But because, so these slots, if I had like a 2-hour AWR report, there would be a zillion of these slots, and I'd have to sort of add up all the samples from all the slots to figure out all the AWR totals. But because this was a 1-slot report, it made things very nice. So basically, if we put this into our little charting mechanism, we add another column for ash. We see ash CPU, CPU plus wait for CPU 6. So I write 60 there. Why is that? Well, this is an AWR report. So the ash interval is 10 seconds, right? So every sample counts for 10 seconds of time. So 6 samples equals 60 seconds, right? And 41 samples on DB file parallel read, which I stack on top of that, equals 410 seconds. And DB file sequential read, 8 samples, 80 seconds. Okay. So now this is actually kind of interesting, right? So ash is sampled, it's kind of coarse-grained, especially over a 2-minute report. We're only talking about 12 samples. In 2 minutes, we're talking about 12 samples, 1 every 10 seconds. So that's pretty coarse-grained. But the ash DB time kind of matches up with the measured DB time pretty well. It's off by 50 seconds, but that's not really so. Certainly not as far off as the sum of CPU and wait times, right? So what do we conclude here? So the ash CPU is way off, but we already made mention of the ash CPU being kind of not trustable because it's derived, and it depends on, if a session is in a wait, it'll never be recorded as being on CPU, right? So that's really what's going on here, right? So we've got CPU in wait. Okay. So what are we concluding about this then? So DB file parallel read is actually consuming considerable, or at least significant, CPU under the wait. If we attribute all of the excess CPU to this one wait event, all of the excess DB CPU to this one wait event, you basically get almost over 30% of the wait actually being on CPU and not technically in the wait. If, according to our model, which is, you're either waiting or you're on CPU, right? Going a little bit further, that would be about 1.1 milliseconds of the 3.3 average wait milliseconds for this I/O. So about a third of the time spent doing this I/O looks like it was actually on CPU and not technically waiting or in a wait. And then if you look in the ash report a little further, I didn't really reproduce this piece, but there's, in the ash part of the AWR report, it actually shows you the breakdown by P1, P2, P3. And so for this particular wait event, we can find out how many blocks were being requested with each read, with each DB file parallel read. And you look at the top 3, the top one was 127, second one was like 126, third one was like 118. So well over 100 blocks per read, so approximately 1 megabyte per read. So kind of do the math, if you're doing about a megabyte in 3.3 milliseconds, you're getting close to 300 millibytes per second I/O off of the DB file parallel read. So that seems like considerably fast. I mean, these are random reads, by the way, right? So the question arises, well, is this a bug? Right? Well, is it a bug? Well, it doesn't conform to the model, right? Well, that doesn't necessarily make it a bug. What it really means is that the model and reality don't always agree so well. Okay, so my friend Yuri Schaff sometimes says it's kind of impossible to go into or out of a wait without using some CPU, right? So there's always going to be some bleed there at the edges, right? So in this case, there's a lot more than just bleed. So we can dig a little bit further. There's OS stat information in AWR, and it's actually time-based, right? These are sort of the OS measurements of time. Idle time, we'll ignore that. We're more interested in user time, sys time, I/O wait time, and then the load number, right? So this load number is kind of interesting, right? So during this 2 minutes, there was 5 average active sessions. But the load was, at the beginning of the interval, 7, and at the end of the interval, 9, right? So there's some extra work going on here. It's not all the database. or at least it's not all known to the database. Right? Database only knows about 5 average active sessions. You can think of the load average as a kind of average active sessions number, right? So it's really, you can compare it to that. So basically, there's extra work going on. So let's actually stack these things up next to our AWR report in a convenient way, right? So if we look at the AWR report, we had 600 total seconds of DB time, broken down into 240 of CPU and 360 of I/O weight, right? So if we stack these numbers from OSStat next to those kind of strategically, put user time on the bottom because that's CPU spent on user processes. So these are only database processes running on this machine, we think. And so, it kind of matches up pretty well there, right? And then the I/O wait time kind of matches up with the DB I/O wait pretty well, right? We've got a pretty good match there. But wait a minute. What's all this stuff on top, right? 450 of sys time, right? So, seems to me like something else is going on. And these numbers, if you work out the math, if you had 450 plus 363 plus 275 divided by 120 seconds, so seconds divided by seconds is average active sessions, right? 8.3, which is right in line with our load average of, starting at 7 and ending at 9, right? So that's kind of a consistency check there. So something is going on this system outside of Oracle, right? It looks like there's something outside of Oracle, using a lot of CPU. And Mr. Slav is a well-known benchmarker, so probably it's not some, random prime number generator that he just forgot to turn off, right? So, so what is Mr. Slav up to? Okay, so he's kind of a well-known benchmarker, and he's pounding. He's obviously trying to pound on the parallel read wait event. Well, why would such a guy do such a thing, right? Maybe he's testing some kind of advanced I/O interfaces that service, reads, and probably writes too. If you're going to service reads, you're probably going to service writes too, right? Maybe he's using some kind of SSD storage, and maybe there's some kind of I/O slaves in the picture that are operating outside of Oracle. But once I/O requests come, they get busy and they chew on the CPU and hand back blocks, right? And that would be a plausible explanation for all that non-database sys time. Under circumstances of a benchmark that's doing an extreme amount of I/O in parallel, right? So if this is true, then we kind of need to factor in all reads. I was starting to blame everything on the DB file parallel read and sort of ignoring the other user I/O event that we had. So just looking at the total reads from AWR and adding up all the CPU seconds, right? The 275 for DB CPU, or the user CPU, and then the 450 for the sys CPU. Doing the math, we get about 0.05 milliseconds of CPU per random read. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm not that's a question for James or somebody. But yeah, it seems like Mr. Slav is kind of experimenting with some kind of exotic I/O / disk / storage infrastructure, and whatever it is, there is a CPU penalty outside of the database to be paid for using it. Not that that's a bad thing. Getting your hands on 128 random blocks in 3 milliseconds sounds pretty good to me. But I'm not an expert at these things. So here's a slide that, maybe you came for, maybe didn't. But, there's a number of cases that are known where the instrumentation can go a little bit awry, and where, so this is a slide where I'm associating symptoms with possible instrumentation issues, right? So if your database CPU is much larger than your ASH CPU, and there's significant wait time in the system, probably it's the same issue as we had here, CPU used under a wait. If your ASH CPU is much greater than your database CPU, well, it's likely that your system may be CPU bound, right? Because ASH includes run queue time. And as we said earlier, DB CPU doesn't, right? So when there's a big discrepancy there, it's likely that those ASH samples on run queue will show up as on CPU. They're in a database call. They're not in a wait, they're waiting for CPU, but that's not an instrumented Oracle wait, right? so they'll show up in Ash as on CPU. If your database time exceeds the sum of DB CPU plus your weight by a significant amount, again, these things have to be sort of more than just a sliver, right? You may be talking about an uninstrumented wait. Why is that? Well, that would be time spent in a call, not in a wait. So it's in a call, so it should count for DB time. It's not in a wait, so it's not an idle wait, so yes, it should count for DB time. But it's not on CPU, right? And so it will be added into database time, but it won't be included in any of the waits, and it's not on CPU. So that's the source of that problem. And then finally, if your DB time is far in excess of your Ash DB time, it could be, because this was a known case, double counted DB time. Again, I said you can trust DB time. We trust DB time implicitly. That's kind of because we think we've worked all the bugs out, right? But there was a big bug early on where job queue time, database time for job queues would get double counted. So basically, DB time for jobs in the job queue would get incrementally counted as the job went along. And then when the job finished, all the accumulated DB time would get posted at once again, right? I had an interesting exchange with an Oracle DBA that was very worried because his average active sessions on one of his most important, one of these important systems spiked to 1,400. And he was like, he got a screenshot of it, right? It's usually down around 50 or 40 or something, right? So he was like in a panic, right? What the heck happened to my system, right? Well, this was a system that ran a bunch of long-running jobs. And, when they finished, they could post a whole lot of DB time. Now, the particular chart he was looking at was based on sysmetrics, right? So that will accumulate changes in DB time over 1 minute intervals, right? So when this large accumulation of DB time got posted all at once, one of the sysmetrics went through the roof, right? The one that got all of that time. So it was kind of interesting. I have a screenshot of it somewhere. It's kind of funny. The other possibility, and I don't know if anyone's seen this in the field, is that Ash can drop samples. Okay, so if you have a super duper duper busy system, it's possible. I'm not saying it's probable. In fact, it seems highly improbable. But Ash can drop samples. If Ash does a sample, it does a consistency check with the active session state. If everything doesn't match up, it copies the active session state again and does another consistency check with the current active session state. And if that doesn't match, it'll drop the sample. So there is a possibility of drop samples under extremely, extremely active system conditions. So I don't know if anybody's ever seen that or not, but you can look for it now. As of I don't know, 11.2 something, there is a column in $Ash info called drop sample count. So I'd be actually very interested in anybody that's got a busy production database, if they actually see any numbers showing up in that column. It'd be very interesting to me anyway. So we are almost at the end of the talk, and it is only halfway through, so you guys will have some time to schmooze or whatever. So final advice, don't believe the unbelievable, right? Question everything, and if it's not believable, don't believe it. But if you're going to trust anything, usually you should trust DB time and DB CPU first, and most. Be wary of Ash CPU and also measured wait times, right? They're not always as accurate as we wish. And always get an Ash report with your AWR report. Now, maybe they should just sort of be coupled together, but, having them both is way more powerful than having either individually. So there is a little bit of information from Ash in the new AWR report. Again, it's at a kind of fine-grained level. It's not really rolled up. But really having an Ash report to compare with an AWR report is nice. And then, don't get stuck in the details if the big picture isn't clear, right? So, that's sort of, don't get stuck in the weeds if you really don't understand, sort of at the high level what's going on. Okay, so I live in Half Moon Bay. It's pumpkin season. This is Farmer John's pumpkin farm before all the hordes came. Very nice job he does. So if you're into pumpkins, come down the coast and visit us. There's still a few left. None of these fine specimens, probably. Anyway, that's the talk. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.